Hello there, this is afternoon for me. It might be morning or evening for you, but it's afternoon for me, and it's actually Thursday even though it's a Tuesday lecture, so I'm getting very confused here. Today we're going to be making some graphs, and I'm going to show you how to do that in R, and we don't have that, we have this. This is my lecture notes in my R project, and I'm going to, just before I start, I'm going to save this one as graphs R underscore post, because if I'm going to fiddle with this, I want to share the fiddle with version with you as well. Alright, so we'll get rid of that. We don't need to see that yet. Alright, so what are we going to be doing today? First thing we're going to need is some data, and so we're going to borrow an idea, part of an idea from last time, to read the data in, and then we're going to have a look at what we've got and see if we can make some interesting graphs. So, what do we have? We have Australian athletes. They are elite athletes. They are at the Australian Institute of Sport. There's 202 of them, and they play a number of different sports. Some of them are male, some of them are female. They're different heights and weights, and other things have been measured on them as well. Today we're going to be using the height, the weight, and the body mass index, which is based on height and weight. And for some reason the values come to us separated by tabs, and that's going to impact reading them in. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to over here. I'm in the wrong place. First of all, we're going to run library tidyverse because everything begins with that. And because I had run library tidyverse before, it didn't actually show me the output. And that's okay. If there's a problem, the problem will show up next. So, we're going to read in the data, and if it was separated by commas, it will be read CSV like we learned last time. And it's not, it's separated by tabs. And there is, handily for us, a function called read underscore TSV, which stands for tab separated values, and that will read in exactly what we have. We're going to take a look at it in a minute, but let's just read it in first and make sure that it worked. So that looks as if that worked. Here is the URL where the file is, if you're playing along. So we have a data frame called athletes, and the read functions tell us what it read in. And you can tell they read in a bunch of columns, the first two of which are text and the rest are numbers. And that all looks extremely reasonable. So what we can do is we can have a look at our data frame, and we can convince ourselves that we have the first 10 of 202 rows, which is good because there were 202 athletes, and there are 13 columns. Now, here's one thing you might not have seen before. If you look at the columns on the page, there's 10 of them. That's how many will fit. It goes up to percent body fat. And you see this arrow over here. This says there are more columns, but I don't have room to show them to you. And if you want to see them, here is percent body fat. Here are the 3 more columns that we didn't see before. It will shuffle the data frame sideways so as to show you the rest of the columns, as many as more as will fit. If we had like 30 columns on here, then we might have another right arrow here, and we might have to click again to see the rest of the columns. But there are 13 columns here, so this is actually all of them. So that seems to be working properly. Now, before we go on, I want to actually show you what the file looks like, and it looks a little bit odd. Here's what it looks like. I'm going to move myself down a bit. Here are the columns. It looks lined up in columns, so it looks as if read underscore table should do it. Except that what is actually happening that we don't know and we can't see by looking at this, we only knew because I told you. What we can't see this happening is that this gap between the ferritin value and the BMI value is actually not 6 or so spaces, but is actually a tab character. Now we can't tell the difference by looking at it, and so we might have tried read underscore table, which I might do like right now. Whereas our studio cloud, there it is. So we're going to go back up here and we're going to make another code chunk which we're going to throw away afterwards. Here, after normal size. So this is me making some extra notes. Read underscore table question mark. So we'll make a new code chunk, and I'll do that properly. I'll say where is my insert? I can't see it. There it is. Insert R. Okay. So what happens if we say read underscore table, and then that thing which I hope I saved, my URL. So what happens if we do that? Okay, this looks kind of messy, but there are some clues here. Now, we got a hint here? Yes. What it tried to do was it tried to make one column called select sport RCC WCC HC all the way down to the end. One column, and there's supposed to be 13, so this is not good. And here is what the one column contains. Female \T, netball \T, 4.56 T, etc., etc. It's trying to crush all those values into one column. And that's not right, because we won't be able to get out things like height and weight. And the hint is in this \T, because between each of those values there is a \T. And \T is R's code for tab. So that's how we know it's actually read TSV is the right thing to do. Now, if I hadn't told you the values are separated by tabs, you would probably have done this first. And you would have run into this, and hopefully you would have recognized, oh, it didn't work. And then you can think about what to do that will make it work. And the \T is the hint. Those separators are not lined up columns. In other words, they're not lined up by spaces. They are lined up by tabs. And so read TSV is what we have to do. Alright, so that didn't work. I'll leave that there for now. But this did work. We have a data frame called athletes. And that seems to be working fine. Now, I have one more small thing to share with you before we get down to business, which is this sport called netball. If you grew up in Britain, or in Australia and New Zealand, or in the Caribbean, any place that was part of the old British Commonwealth, and you were a girl, you probably played netball in school. It's like a British Commonwealth version of basketball, except that it has no dribbling and it has passing but no running with the ball. And it's kind of an interesting sport. I was just watching the 1918 Commonwealth Games final, which was between England and Australia, and these women are very good. They know what they're doing. So if you want to find netball, you can find it on YouTube, because I did. Alright, let me go back to here. So we did library tidyverse, we read the data incorrectly and got it to work. Here's what it looks like. Now, save this slide because you will be coming back to this many times. What this says is, what kind of graph can I draw? We know about some different kinds of graph because we've learned them in B22, B27 or equivalent courses. And here we're going to try and unify the ideas so that the graphs come from the same place, and we can think about which of the graphs do we know about should we draw. And the way I've sorted this out is to say how many categorical variables do I have and how many quantitative ones do I have. And based on those numbers, you can then think about what kind of itchy nose, what kind of graph should I be drawing. So for example, the second line, if I have one quantitative variable and no categorical variables, this suggests I should draw a histogram. So for example, I can just sneak ahead, there's a histogram. And the quantitative variable I had was body mass index, which is a number, so that works all very well. And then this did produce a histogram. So that's jumping ahead of the game a bit. So what you do first is you say, how many variables do I want to include in my graph? What kind of variables are they? So knowing about the difference between categorical and quantitative is important. And then you can find your situation in here, and that will tell you what kind of graph to draw, and shortly we'll be finding out how to draw those different types of graph. Now, this might not tell the whole story, because you might have particularly more categorical variables. And then the question is, what do you do then? And we have it out. We have a method called faceting, which produces separate plots by groups. I'll show you that at the end. And that gives you another way of making graphs if you have more categorical variables than you would like. Alright, so now we need to go back to here, and we'll see if we can make a bar chart. So the first thing we have to say, get rid of that. The first thing we have to say is that there is a standard thing called ggplot. That's what all the graphs start with in the tidyverse that we're using. If you've ever run into plot before, you can forget about that for this course. ggplot is what we're doing. And we're using ggplot in different ways to get the kind of graph we want. So, let's think about how we're going to make a graph of the sports played by the athletes. Well, we can go back to our data. Sport is categorical, it's actually text here. So the text is a clue that's categorical. It could possibly be netball, or it could possibly be basketball, or rowing, or swimming, or tennis, or field athletics, or track, or 400-meter runner, or anything like that. It's categorical, and it has a number of different levels, meaning the different sports. So that's what we want to do. That's categorical. We've got one categorical variable, and we go back to here and we say, that would be a bar chart. So we're going to make a bar chart. Now I'm going to do this first, and I will talk about the code in a minute. Here is a bar chart, and it seems to be a bit too big. So I'm going to shrink this a little bit, and so we can see it all. The text is going to be, for the moment, a little bit too small. So, what is a bar chart? It says, what different sports are there? They are these. How many athletes were there playing each sport? It counts them up. And then the height of the bar says how many athletes there were. So there were pushing 40 rowers. Rowing being the tallest bar, some of them male, some of them female. There were only 4 gymnasts. They were all female, as it turned out. So this gives you a quick picture of one categorical variable, the simplest kind of graph. How many are in each level? How many athletes played each sport? So that was the simplest kind of graph. Now we need to go back and look at the code, and because the code is now too small, we're going to blow it up a bit. 140%, there we go, that will be good. And I'm just thinking about something else. If I blow this up to the full screen, I then lose me, so I'm going to get rid of that. Alright, start with ggplot. That's the first thing. The second thing is always a data frame. And we only have one data frame. It's the one called athletes that contains all that information about the athletes. And I called it athletes because when I read it in, not this one. When I read it in with read TSV, I called it athletes. Athletes gets read TSV from that URL. So our data frame is called athletes. Then there are 2 things we have to worry about. Thing number 1, what to plot. Thing number 2, how to plot it. So this is about the simplest version of that because we only have one categorical variable, which is sport. And in a bar chart, the categorical variable goes acrossways, so that's the X on your graph. So this business with AES, which stands for aesthetic spelled the British way, with the AES on the front. This says, what do I plot? I take the column called sport and I make a plot out of that. Now, if we've only gotten this far, then we haven't said anything about how to plot it. So this is not going to make a graph yet. So this geom bar at the end is saying, take whatever is in here namely the spores, and make a bar chart out of it. Following the specification here, the spore goes acrossways, so we're going to make a bar chart of the spore going acrossways. And that was what this did. This is a bit big now. So that's the simplest kind of graph that you can imagine. That's a bar chart, one categorical variable which goes acrossways, so it's x. X is across, as my old math teacher used to say. So that's a bar chart. Alright, so suppose we have a variable like body mass index, which is weight divided by height squared or whatever it is. And that's for normal people used as a measure of obesity. There's a bit more to that with these athletes, which we'll get to shortly. Alright, ggplot, athletes, and then the what to plot. We're going to plot a body mass index, which again is going to go acrossways on our plot, because the values of BMI are going to be on the x-axis. So that's x again. And then we say we want to make a histogram of this. Geom histogram. We'll make a histogram. And I'll talk about the bins thing in a minute. So let me run that. And I'm going to have to shrink this to get you to see it. So this is going to be extremely annoying. Doop, doop, doop. And here's the histogram. Here are the values of BMI. And as you remember from drawing a histogram by hand, which you did back at the beginning of B22 or someplace like that, what you do is you divide the values up into intervals, and you count how many observations there were in each interval. So there were 1 or 2 athletes who had a BMI over 30, was 1 and 2 and 1, I guess that's 4. There were some athletes who had a very small BMI under 20, but most of them were kind of in here around 23, 24. And that's the histogram. And all the work of drawing the histogram is done by the geom histogram. It sorts out the intervals and it counts up how many observations there are in each one. So there's nothing that you have to do, no counting that you have to do, that you would have to do if you were drawing this by hand. Now, I have to talk about the bins. And the easiest way to think about that is to make a copy of this. Copy that. And we'll paste this up here. This is why I have the paste. No, not paste. Paste. There we go. So let's take the bins out. And now, of course, I'm sitting over the go button. So I'm going to move myself down. And there's my go button over there. Alright. We get a warning. And we get an awful histogram. Because there's too many bars. Too many what in the terminology of this is called bins. And the thinking behind all of this is to say this is obviously a bad histogram, because the reason for drawing a histogram is you want to show shape. You want to get a sense of center and spread and shape. And the number of bins that you might need to use depends on the data that you have. So the thinking is you need to supply a number of bins, and the thinking behind that is you might need to try several different numbers of bins until you find one that tells your story. So when I was designing these nodes, I played around and I found out that 10 bins was pretty good. 30 bins is obviously too many. Let's try something like, 4. You can kind of guess what's going to happen here. This is going to look awful in the other direction. So let's see if we can make that run. 4 bins. Does that tell you anything about the shape? Not really, because almost all the shape is gone using 4 bins. So 4 bins is not enough. 30 is definitely too many. 10 seems to be a reasonable number because you can see the shape going up, coming down slower, so skewed to the right in the jargon that we've been thinking about shape. Here is the center somewhere around here. There's about this much spread. The shape goes up and comes down slowly to the right. Now, when I'm doing this in a lecture room, what I do is I walk all the way over to the right hand side of the lecture theatre doing this with my hands, illustrating the shape, and I don't really have enough room to do that here. Okay, now go further away. So going to it now, I got to do this so you see this. One side, which is actually my left hand, is a long tail. Well, yes, is a long tail. And the other side is a short tail. The side where the long tail is the side where it's skewed. This is skewed to the right. Some people call this positively skewed. So that's the shape of this distribution. Having 10 bins shows it. Having 30 bins, come back. I've gone over to completely the wrong place. Having 4 bins doesn't show it. Or having 30 bins doesn't really show it either. It kind of does, but you have to look at a lot of rubbish around the shape of the distribution because you've got these outlying points over here. And they are really part of the shape. They're really part of the long tail. So when you draw a histogram, you have to choose a number of bins, and the way to choose a number of bins is to try something and see how it looks, see if it has too many bins or too few, and adjust appropriately until you think you have a good picture of the shape. And what you want is something fairly smooth like this, so you can see that the shape goes up and comes down slower. So there's a lot to think about with the histogram. There's more to think about with the histogram than there was with the bar chart, which is why I started with the bar chart. So histogram needs a number of bins. It won't supply you one automatically. You have to figure out what number of bins to choose. Alright, what do we have next? We have what sports were played by males and females. So let's have that. Now, we've got sport and we've got sex, male and female. Categorical. So we need the appropriate graph that will work for 2 categorical variables, which is a grouped bar chart. Now you might not have seen one of these before, and I will show you how this one goes so that you can play with it. And I'm going to draw it first, and then we'll come back and look at the code. Bigger. This one came out rather small for some reason. Alright, at least we can see the whole thing here. So along the x-axis we have the sports. Red and blue by colour we have males and females. And that's how it's showing the 2 categorical variables. The reason for doing it this way round is what you might want to do, it depends, but what you might want to do is for each sport compare how many males and females play it. So for basketball over here, for example, there's about an equal number of males and females. The field athletes are predominantly male, the gymnasts are all female, the water polo players over here are all male, and so on and so forth. So and netball are all female too. Some sports are all one sex, all male or all female, and some of them are mostly one sex, and some of them are all mixed up, like rowing, for example, has males and females, also has both of them represented. So when you have 2 categorical variables, this idea of a group bar chart is a way of comparing how many of one categorical variable there are within each category of the other one. Now, I want to play with this a bit, but before I do that, I'm going to tell you about the code. I'm going to try. I'm now making this even smaller, which is really very stupid. 140% is a good size for the code. Alright, here is our code. ggplot, athletes, AES, bracket. Always the same. Now, we've got some thinking to do because one of those categorical variables is going to go on the x-axis, which in this case was the sport. And the other one is going to be made colors. And the way to make that happen is to say x equals the one you want on the x-axis, and fill equals the one that's going to make the colors. There is also a one called color, which I will just quickly show you, which we'll end up using mostly later on. I'll just show you how that one behaves. Now what you get is black bars with colors around the outside, which is not really very nice. What you want is you want to have colored bars filled in with their color, which is why this one is called fill. There we go, that's what we had before. And so that makes more sense. So when you're designing one of these things, you've got to think about which variable is going to be my x-axis, which one is going to be my colors. And if you switch it around, I really should be showing you this in another one, but not Gil, fill. So if you switch the fill and the x around, now see what we get. And I'm going to have to shrink this again, excuse me. There, that will do. Now we've got sport as colors, and there are 10 different sports, so we have 10 different colors. So this is very colorful, but I don't know how informative it is. You've got two sexes on the x-axis, female over on the left and males over on the right. And I don't know whether it's easy to compare because the colors are kind of similar to each other. So I don't think this graph is effective. It's comparing sports within females and then sports within males. And you find that there are not very many male tennis players, there's a lilac one. And there are not very many female gymnasts with this kind of olive green one. But you have to work a lot harder to figure that out. And so I like it the other way around. I had to play with this when I was putting these notes together. And I thought, well, I don't like the other one. I like this one a lot better with the colors, 2 colors for males and females. If you're distinguishing things by colors, you don't want to have too many colors. So one argument here is to say, well, sex has fewer categories, male and female just 2. Sport has 10, because there are 10 different sports. So therefore, I should do my fill as sex with fewer categories, so I'm only going to have 2 colors. And I'm going to have 10 pairs of bars. And what that will give me is a comparison within each sport of how many males and females play it. And that seems to be a reasonable way to go. So I think that's the way I want to do it. So I like it this way. Now, we've got one more piece of attention to think about here. And that is this position equals dodge. I appreciate this text is probably a bit small for you to see. I guess I could make it a bit bigger. Except that we then have to lose our graph. There we go. This position equals dodge. So the obvious question to think about is what happens if I take it out. So I'm just going to cut that for the minute. And if I take this out, what I get is something that looks a lot more Excel-like. This is called a stacked bar chart. And maybe gives you a sense of how many athletes there are altogether playing each sport. And here is rowing, which is the commonest one, up near 40. And what this does not give you, which I like oftentimes, is a comparison of the 2 categories within here. You can see, perhaps if you look carefully, that the bar above rowing, the red bar above rowing, is a bit taller than the blue one. So there are more female rowers than male rowers, but you have to work hard to figure this out. And what the position equals dodge, let's put that back in. What that does is it puts the 2 bars that are part of fill, instead of putting them one on top of each other, it puts them one beside each other. And you can compare, for example, for tennis players, there are not very many, but there are more female ones than male ones. And so on and so forth. So I like this kind of setup, where you have an X and a fill, and a position equals dodge in here to put the bars side by side. That's what I like. So I think that's a better way to do it. So, a lot of extra chat here. What is our next graph? Box plots. Box plots you know about. Box plots are very friendly things when you have one categorical and one quantitative variable. So, let's dig out one of those. Body mass index by gender. So, gender is male and female, that's categorical. Body mass index is a number, so we want to make a box plot out of that because we have one of each, or so a pair of box plots, I suppose. And now we have to shrink this because it's too big. Something of this kind. So sex, the categorical variable sex in this case goes on the x-axis, and the quantitative one goes on the y-axis. And you get the familiar look of a box plot with median in the middle, third quartile at the top, first quartile at the bottom, and then outliers plotted separately, values that are unusually high or low, and whiskers connecting the box to the furthest out point that's not an outlier. And if you remember doing this in B22 or some such place, you might remember that business of 1.5 times the interquartile range. Anything more than that much above Q3 or below Q1 is an outlier. So that's the idea. The thing about box plots, we'll make this a bit smaller again. The thing about box plots is that they're nice for comparing groups. We've got one group which is males and females, one categorical variable here. They're nice for comparing something measured between groups. And that's exactly what we have here. And the other thing is that they're based on medians and quartiles. And so you're not going to be messed around by means and standard deviations if that's not something you should be using. A box plot was invented by a chap called John Tukey, and we'll see him again later on. This was back in the 1950s, and the idea was, because we didn't have computers in those days, well, I say we, I wasn't born then, because there were no computers in the 50s, Tukey wanted to devise a nice comparative plot that you could do by pencil and paper, and the median, the quartiles, and interquartile range were things you could work out. They were not too hard. You put your data values in order and chop them off. And then you can work out where these outliers are. And so that was Tukey's idea. And I think box plots are very effective. I'm also dying of thirst, excuse me. Alright, code. And I need this bigger again. Back up to, I'm going the other way. Back up to 140. There. Box plots are actually very easy. You just have to get the x and the y the right way around. So on a box plot, the categorical thing is the x because the categorical variable is making vertical box plots. And the quantitative variable goes up and down, is on the y. So get the x and the y right, and then plus G on box plot. You don't need anything else. That will do a default box plot, which is perfectly good. Box plots, you will see them all over the place, especially in this course. It's a very useful plot because you often have something measured which differs according to groups. And what you see in this case, shrink, shrink, shrink. That's too small. No, that's good. You can see that the body mass index of the males is on average a bit bigger than for the females, and there are some unusually high values. Now I want to talk about those. Because if you think about a normal person, not an athlete, like you and me, then having a high body mass index is dangerous. And your doctor will tell you have to eat a better diet or you have to exercise more because it's all connected with being overweight or being obese. And so for a normal person, having a high body mass index is a problem. Now there are some athletes who have really high, these people would be obese if they were like you and me. Except that these are athletes, so the reason they are heavy is not because they're fat, it's because they have lots of muscle. They are really strong. And I think what's happening with these people up at the top here, the female as well, is that these people are things like field athletes where they have to be throwing something heavy. The shot put, for example, you have this ball which goes under your chin, and then you try and throw it by pushing your arm. It's called the shot put. And if you're going to be a good shot putter, you really have to be strong. You have to have lots of muscle. Because if you're going to propel a ball with your arm like this, you need to have a good strong arm. And so these people with high BMI are actually not obese. They are just really strong. And they do something which depends on strength. If you were thinking North America, you might think of a football player like a lineman. The big thing about them is being big and strong. And they would have a high body mass index too. And as we will see later on, is typically the way the males are typically bigger than the females. Bigger meaning heavier relative to their height, in this case. Alright, so that's enough of that. So what we're doing here is we're going through the code and the plot and the interpretation. So we're doing rather a lot of things all at once. Okay, height versus weight. Let's make this a bit bigger again. There we go. Now, if you have two quantitative variables and no categorical ones at all, then this is scatterplot country. And so what we want to do is we want to make a scatterplot. We'll plot the x against the y. So let's see how that goes. And you're getting the picture here, I hope. ggplot, data frame, what to plot, how to plot it. So for our scatter plot, we need both an x and a y. And these could be either way around. You typically have the response variable on the y and the explanatory one on the x, except that we don't really have either of those. You don't have a larger weight because you're taller or whatever. So I chose to do it this way around. Height is x, weight is y. And to make the plot the points, g on point will do that. So let's see how that looks. And then we'll make it smaller again. I remember getting very annoyed by this last year. Smaller again. There we go. Height on the x, weight on the y. Now, you might be looking at those numbers on the axes and thinking, what kind of units are these? I didn't actually tell you. Now, the clue is the data come from Australia, and Australia has everything in metric, even more than we do here. So the heights are in centimetres, and the weights are in kilograms. And I was watching some rugby from New Zealand one time, and they were telling me this player was 95 kilograms, and I had to stop and how heavy is this? I need pounds. So 100 kilograms is 220 pounds, if you want a clue. And the picture that we're getting from the scatter plot is this seems to go uphill. That is to say, the taller you are, the heavier you likely are as well. And I don't know whether that's intuitive or not, but that's true for these athletes. And then there are some outliers, these points up here. These people seem to be unusually heavy given how tall they are. And these are the big strong ones that we talked about with the body mass index. These are the shot putters and discus throwers that we were talking about before. Alright, so the code here is nothing to it. G on point. So set up what to plot, get the axes right, and then just G on point. This is not very exciting. Alright, we're going to tart this up a bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to put the regression line on this plot. If you think this relationship is reasonably straight, shrink. If you think this relationship is reasonably straight, which it looks as if it is, apart from these guys, then it makes sense to put a regression line on there and say, well look, height does appear to go up with weight according to this relationship. So that seems to make some kind of sense. The grey envelope, which is quite small here, is a measure of uncertainty. If you've done regression, you've done confidence interval for the mean response. That's what this is. So it seems to show a nice upward trend there. Alright, so now we have to go back and have a look at our code. Okay, enlarge. Enlarge, enlarge. Okay, I will eventually get used to this. So, all that we do here is we add, literally plus, something to the previous graph. So, ggplot data frame, AES, x equals this, y equals that, geom point, plus, add that to the previous graph. This thing is called geom smooth, and this adds a smooth trend to the graph. Now, I'm going to show you what happens if we take it out. Cut that and redraw the graph. Now, you might not see much difference. Let's show you the whole graph again. This blue trend now wiggles a bit. If you look very carefully, you can see it's kind of wiggly. This is called a low S curve. You can see method equals low S. That's the default for geom smooth. And that will fit a curve that goes kind of through the data. And if you think it looks reasonably straight, as I think you would here, then you could say, well, actually, I think a regression line would be just as good. So let's put the regression line back. And you can see that a straight line really does work perfectly well there with a bit of scatter. So there is another principle here, which is that the water plot can consist of several things. In this case, it was the points plus a smooth curve going through them. Now I mentioned this method equals LM thing here, which is too small for you to see, so I'm going to blow it up again. I'm going to shrink it again. Alright, blow it up again. This one, method equals LM. What we will find later on is that when we come to regressions, predicting y from x, then LM is the function that we use to do that. And so when ggplot was being designed, they used the same term LM as a reminder that we're going to fit a linear regression predicting weight from height. And so using method equals LM, we'll add a regression line. And that's the kind of mnemonic for how it works. We're doing it backwards. We're doing the graph first, but you have a mnemonic now that LM will do regression, which we'll see in about 6 weeks. Alright, so we have some other things. How about body mass index by sport and gender? Okay, quantitative, categorical, categorical. Alright, what are we going to do with 1 quantitative and 2 categorical variables? Let's go back and have a look. 1 quantitative, 2 categorical, grouped box plots. Alright, how are we going to make that work? So what you do is you set this up like it was going to be a box plot. So we've got sport and we've got sex. Yeah, get rid of that. We've got sport and sex as our categorical variables, and just like we did before with the group bar chart, it usually makes sense to have the categorical variable with the more categories on the x-axis. That's sport here. And then we can add color equals sex to distinguish the males and females by colors. Alright, what's that going to look like? That is going to be a very colorful thing. It looks like this. This is going to be a bit small to see. So the red box plots are the females, and the blue ones are the males. And on the x-axis we have each sport. So, if you think about basketball, which is the first one, here is the female box plot down here. Here is the male box plot, which is a bit higher. And this is saying for the basketball players, the males tend to have a higher body mass index than the females, though there are outliers. And the field athletes are up here. Some of them have a very high body mass index. Those are the shot putters. And you can compare the other sports. So this is giving you a comparison within each sport of body mass index for males and females. A little bit of a lot to keep in track. This is your one thing you're measuring, body mass index. and you want to compare males and females in terms of that for each sport. So we've got sport and sex as two categorical variables. Obviously I'm doing a lot of talking today. So this is a grouped box plot, and you can be guided by the colours to compare males and females within each sport. Alright, height and weight by gender. Height and weight are quantitative, gender is categorical. And the way to think about this is this last one here. Scatter plot with points identified by colour, for example. So we're going to have the males and females on our scatter plot in different colours. And this is actually exactly what you would guess. Let's show you the code first, because I think we can get this. So, ggplot athletes, x equals height, y equals weight, colour equals sex. Make the sexes different colours, and then plot them as points. So this is in fact exactly what you would have guessed. Let's shrink this so we can see it. So all the red dots are females, the height and weight for the females, and the blue dots are males, height and weight for the males, and just as you would guess, the males are bigger than the females in terms of being both taller and heavier overall. There are some exceptions. Here is a female who is especially heavy. Well, here is a female that's heavy for her height. Here is a female that looks like a male in terms of height and weight. And here is another one. And here is a small male, neither tall nor heavy. So there is a bit of mixing up, but the overall picture is the males are bigger than the females, taller and heavier. And if that's the story you want to tell, this is a good kind of graph to tell it with. So I think we're beginning to get the idea here that we can add things like colour to any other graph to distinguish points that belong to groups by colour. Or we can add colour to box plots to get box plots of a different colour according to whether they're male or female. Last thing. So I'm going to reproduce that last graph. So let's reproduce that last graph. This is exactly the same code as we just had. You recall this from like 2 minutes ago. So, here we saw that overall, the taller athletes were heavier and the males were bigger than the females. That was what we saw. Now, what about if we want to see if that holds true for every single sport? So somewhere what we've got to do is we've got to add sport to this graph. And the problem with that is that we now have two quantitative and two categorical variables, with too many for this last line. So this is where the faceting comes in. If you have too many categorical variables, as we do here, we have sport and sex, what you can do is you can produce separate plots by groups. This is called faceting now. So let's have a look at how that goes. I'm going to draw this graph first. And what you get is a separate little scatter plot for each graph. This is height and weight for males and females, just as before, but separately for basketball, field athletics, gymnastics, netball, etc. And there are 10 of these little graphs. And then you can look at these and you can say, is it true that taller goes with heavier within a sport? Or is it more naturally true that males tend to be bigger than females for most sports, which does seem to be the case? And it's a little bit less clear that there is an upward relationship between height and weight when you look at males and females separately. It's typically more true, for example, if you look at tennis players, the male ones are all up here, and the female ones are all down here. The male ones are taller and heavier than the female ones. But within males, or within females, within a sport, there doesn't seem to be much happening. For example, the water polo players are all men, and there doesn't seem to be any real relationship here at all. Alright, how do we get that? Enlarge. What I did was I added something else to the end of the graph, need more water. So, what I'm thinking is I want to do this separately for each sport. And I forget about the sport until right at the end. So, if I look at what we had before, there's no mention of sport in here anywhere. And that will get us one box plot from height and weight for males and females for all the sports together. So now if I want to do this separately for each sport at the end, I add in this code here. Facet wrap, squiggle, and then the thing I want separate plots for, in this case sport. So that will produce, these are called facets, 10 separate graphs, one for each sport. And I'm now thinking that I could have done something like that earlier. For example, if I wanted to do height and weight for males and females. So let's see if we can squeeze that in here. So let's make a scatter plot of height versus weight, ignoring the genders first. So we'll copy this, and then we'll edit that. We'll take out the gender, take out sex, and what that will do right now, is it will produce an ordinary scatter plot of height versus weight that we saw before. So, what about if I want to do one of these for males and one of these for females? I could do that too. So, plus facet wrap. My typing is as usual offset facet wrap. I can't spell either. And then squiggle, and then we want to do this by capital S, sex. Not White Sox or Red Sox, but sex. There we go. So if we run that now, and let's shrink that so we can see it all. One more time. Now this is height and weight. So if you combine all the sports together, it's still true that for females, taller ones tend to be heavier. And it's still true for males that taller ones tend to be heavier. So this is another way of showing what we showed in this plot here, which was comparing males and females in terms of height and weight by putting them on the same graph. Or we could put them on separate graphs. And whichever you think tells your story better, now that you know about facets, you can do it either way. And it's whatever helps you tell your story the best. The graph is at your service. So let's go back to this one a minute. We had males and females height and weight for each sport separately. And one thing, well, there's a couple of things you might notice here. One of them is that these points don't fill their facets. Here are the gymnasts. They're short and light, so they're all down here, and this facet is almost empty. And likewise, none of the tennis players are very heavy, because tennis involves lots of running, so you don't want to be too heavy. And so the top half of the facet for tennis is empty. And likewise, the water polo players are all tall, so this half of the facet is empty. So another way you can organize this is to say, if I want all those facets to be filled up, I can't get to this because we're at the bottom. What it does, this, is to create separate scales for each facet. So now the gymnasts fill their box, and now you might get a better picture of height versus weight for each sport because all the boxes are filled up. The problem is, if you want to compare sports one with another, you can't really do that from here. You can't compare sprinting with water polo because these numbers are different. If you want that, it's better to go back to here with the same scales. And the last thing I'm going to say is the code for this one. Inside the facet wrap, if you put scales equals 3, it gives each facet its own scales. So the netball players are this, the gymnasts are all small, so the weight only goes up to 47 kilograms. But the other ones are different. So once again, you have a certain amount of choice in terms of what you want to do. So that was more or less the end of what I wanted to say. I'll just take you back to this. Keep this slide handy, because if it says, give me a suitable graph, now you know what a suitable graph is, and now you know how to make one. Count up how many categorical, how many quantitative variables you have. Make the right graph. If you have too many categorical ones, think about using facets. Think about facet wrap, like we did right at the end. And I think that's run me out of voice, so I think that's also run us out of lecture for today.